Welcome and thank you for viewing my talk, A Field Guide to Mapping with Quantitative Color. A transcript and slides are available to download on the conference Slack channel. I also want to acknowledge that I am presenting from the traditional territory of the Ka, Osage, and Kickapoo nations. The focus of this talk is a side project involving a large collection of quantitative color schemes that I needed to organize, and so I decided to design a field guide for them. It has been a welcome distraction during the ongoing pandemic. I'll begin with the briefest of backstories. Over the past 5 years, I have been researching historical and contemporary uses of quantitative color schemes. This topic has become something of a passion project. At the 2015 conference, I presented on trends and patterns of color use in contemporary mapping. And last year, I discussed how the use of quantitative color has changed over the past 150 years, and why map makers use the colors that they do. You can view that talk on the NACIS YouTube channel. Underpinning this research is my collection of over 2,000 sampled color schemes, with another 1,000 plus patiently awaiting evaluation, all slowly being shaped into a database. Now, I spent a large part of my graduate studies building and maintaining data sets and databases, and it always bothered me how I never seemed to have time or energy left over for creative pursuits. And that's what this guide represents, an opportunity to organize these color schemes in a creatively fulfilling way, while at the same time producing a resource that will benefit the cartographic and data visualization communities. There's another reason this side project is important. I've learned a lot and I've forgotten a lot about color use over the past few years, so much so that I find myself constantly referring to the scores of excellent publications and online resources that overflow my hard drive and bookmark folders. For instance, I could sort through my notes on the effects of saturation and lightness levels on scheme quality, or I could simply click on the link to Lisa Rost's excellent data wrapper post from September. But I'm tired of searching through these resources for a refresher on some random color concept. And I've noticed a recurring limitations as pertains to my work. There are many, many color schemes out there, or well, more correctly, there are many, many variations of just a few basic scheme categories. But among those variations are a host of perceptual issues and design challenges that, in my opinion, are often inadequately explored or illustrated. And when you consider all the different design communities using quantitative color, it's hard keeping track of who is doing what. So yes, there are plenty of excellent resources out there, and I'll happily point you in their direction, but I need all of this color information in one place. So ultimately, this color guide is a labor of necessity as much as it is a labor of love. And of course, I know exactly how I want to organize it. So why are field guides my design inspiration? Regardless of subject matter, I always enjoy flipping through them, studying the illustrations, and learning new facts. They excel at organizing large quantities of information presented in a way that invites exploration, appealing to novice and experts alike. And quite simply, I love their order, their design symmetry. You know where to look for the information you need because every entry and often every page is designed the same way. And that's really all I'm doing here, organizing a color scheme taxonomy in a consistent, logical manner. So I'll highlight typical entries from two classic bird guides, Audubon and Peterson. They contain the same general information, follow the same basic deductive process of bird identification, and tend to make similar concessions in their attempts to balance the quantity of information with an appropriate level of detail. Peterson set the template for modern bird guides, concise taxonomic information, attractive illustrations, and a systematic method for bird identification by asking questions such as, what shape are its wings? Each entry displays the same basic information accompanied by a visual reference on the facing page. The entry for whooping cranes is representative of the entire guide. It contains a few descriptive blurbs and stats, plus basic information on 6 categories, the bare minimum necessary to ID the species. And the illustration is an idealized version of the bird to show off key identifying marks with arrows to direct the reader's attention. The text is efficient, the illustrations are illuminating, and they fit together seamlessly. Although this edition is somewhat outdated, it remains an excellent guide. Audubon popularized photography over illustrations, and compared to Peterson, takes a more prose-like approach. Information design is cleaner and more thoughtful. And when it comes to pocket guides, this is what I think of. And yet, from a user's perspective, there are some notable disadvantages to its content and layout. Entries often cross pages, and due to the different paper materials, species photographs are in a separate section, resulting in a disjointed reading experience. For instance, the Virginia rail entry is on page 466, but its photograph is way back on page 267. You are forced to flip back and forth to read a full entry. And given the guide is a visual aid, you'd expect a more seamless integration of imagery. Another odd drawback of this edition is how it oversimplifies the bird identification process, so much so that you are better off referring to a companion handbook titled How to Identify Birds. Now, this handbook is interesting because it attempts to capture the variety of bird behaviors and characteristics using only 2 types of data visualizations, photographic small multiples and color-coded 1 and 2 variable tables. I like small multiples for their intuitiveness. For example, mobbing behaviors is one of 24 illustrated flight behaviors. At a glance, I can get a sense of the nuance of mobbing behaviors among different species, in much the same way that, say, ColorBrewer illustrates the nuance of a color scheme across different data class sizes. I adopted and greatly expanded the small multiple approach in my color guide, an approach too often missing from other online color resources. Either they display too few applications of a given color scheme, or they only use an idealized data set to show off a given scheme at its best or worst. In contrast, the tables are time-consuming and less informative. Looking at the goals column in the image on the right, we can see that, yes, they do exhibit mobbing behavior, but we learn nothing about the nature of their mobbing behavior that helps identification. It's sort of a cautionary visualization for me. Aim for high information density, but avoid information overload. To extract schemes to a degree that the reader is looking at graphs and charts rather than the colors themselves. So across these 3 publications, you can see the overall field guide experience aims for the encyclopedic and comprehensive, but can easily veer into either underwhelming or overwhelming territory. It's a difficult needle to thread. So now I will show some material from the guide itself and how inspiration from the bird guides has helped my creative process. As this is a work in progress and dependent on my main color research, neither the content nor the overall design are finalized, but I can illustrate what I have been working toward over the past year. So the guide is divided into 4 major parts. Each part builds into the next, although I'm writing them to stand on their own. Part 1 is an overview of quantitative color, which is separated into 3 sections and introduces the concept of quantitative color, provides an abridged version of the history I outlined last year, and examines issues surrounding its use. Part 2 is an illustrated glossary, and you can see a basic example here on mock bands. It's a visual aid for relevant concepts and terms in the guide. In my opinion, the best way to explain ideas such as perceptual distance or simultaneous contrast or mock bands is through illustration. I've never really seen a comprehensive collection like this, and it's possible that this will end up being the most helpful resource of the entire guide. Part 3 are the quantitative color schemes, the main feature of this guide, and the section most inspired by the bird guides. And I'll show those in just a minute. Part 4 are a handful of color selection walkthroughs, including step-by-step general purpose and context-specific walkthroughs, similar to the deductive how to identify a bird process found in most bird guides. I think this is a helpful way to close out the guide because it shows the reader how I think they can make use of all of the preceding information when faced with their own design challenges. So I am sorting all schemes into 10 major categories, plus their relevant subcategories. They are sequential, diverging, rainbow, traffic, hypsometric, bivariate, cyclic or repeating, and waveform, which can be thought of as grouped sequential or grouped diverging schemes. And 2 more which are not displayed, multivariate, and then miscellaneous, a catch-all category. Taking direct cues from bird guides, my fundamental guiding principle is that every important piece of information must be paired with a visualization on the same page. This ensures 2 things. 1, that the reader won't have to flip back and forth to match an illustration with its relevant text, which is something that annoys me with the Audubon guide. And 2, the same information appears in more or less the same location for every entry. That way, if you want to compare, say, the data matching capabilities of any 2 schemes, you won't have to waste time scanning the page for the relevant passages. Every entry contains 4 basic design elements, which helps me maintain style consistency. Standardized information categories is the first. The scheme descriptions that make up the main entry. Every entry will cover the same information categories. The second, inline illustrations. They're visual aids to highlight important characteristics of the scheme. The third element is a marginalia. It's a feature of my favorite text and one used effectively by Audubon. It's a combination of column headings, callouts, and footnotes. I can draw little arrows to relevant entries. And then the fourth element is use case illustrations. These are the small multiples of the scheme as both standalone color ramps and also applied to a variety of map scenarios. It's similar to the small multiples of the Audubon handbook or the range maps found in most bird guides. I want to illustrate the nuances of a given scheme when applied to a variety of mapping situations. And currently, I am unsure how lengthy this section and the guide as a whole will become, because I continue to uncover schemes that merit inclusion. I've completed nearly 25. Another 25 or so are planned, and if I'm not careful, I will surpass 100 by the new year. But I don't mind, because as I said before, it may have started as a labor of necessity, but it is now a labor of love. I want to end by thanking Mamitha, Nick, and everyone on the board for making this conference happen, Jenny for moderating our session, and all of my fantastic co-presenters, and then of course you. I will be in the Slack channel if you want to get in touch. Thank you.